What's up, everybody? Back with another video. I told you all I would be giving you some updates on the Ashes of Creation Intrepid Studios situation. Of course, I think a lot of you kind of hung out with me over the weekend on Saturday as we were sort of breaking some news, and I've had several sources come forward that we've been chatting now over the last several days, sharing information. And so I wanted to, help sort of enlighten everyone as to what's going on, sort of be a voice for some of those in the studio. Keep in mind, a lot of this has to be very carefully done. I think some of you are probably watching Kira. He's also been putting some really great content out on what's been going on. You do want to be very mindful of sources and sort of what's being said. So, as you watch and listen, just to sort of keep that in mind. What I plan to do is probably a 3 or 4 part series here. This is just sort of the start. As we continue to gather more information and sort of move things forward with the folks that I've been talking with. You'll probably notice this is a little bit different of a video for me as well. Usually we have footage and stuff going, but I also don't really want to have any reason to have a takedown or anything by using footage. So I don't know that would happen, but so this is just my lovely face here looking at you as we go forward. So, first I just want to say this, the report is, this is based off a combination of, public records, public statements, information that's been shared with me by current, former employees, and individuals with direct knowledge of events that have been going on at Intrepid Studios. Some of this is information is not been publicly released by the company. I'm not going to publish confidential documents or private communications, so you will not see any of that here. And some details remain really disputed or incomplete. So where information comes from non-public sources, I'll try to state that pretty clearly. This is an ongoing situation. So, many of these details really might change over the next few days or a few weeks. So, really over the past weekend, events involving Intrepid Studios really started to unfold pretty rapidly, right? Based on information from multiple sources, Intrepid Studios really clearly is in the process of either winding down or shutting down. Employees report layoffs, missed payroll, and the termination or impending termination of benefits. If Ashes of Creation moves forward in the future, it would likely do so under circumstances very different from what players were originally promised. And as I mentioned, really this video is the first and hopefully a series really examining what has happened, how it developed, and what it might mean going forward. So really to understand how the studio reached this point, it's really necessary to begin in mid 2024. In May of 2024, and we've covered this a lot already, there was a UCC filing that was recorded against Intrepid Studios. At the time, no foreclosure had occurred. However, the filing established creditor rights that later became central to discussions about control and restructuring. And then in June 2024, a legal request was filed seeking access to Intrepid Studios financial records by a stockholder pursuant to Section 1601 of the California Corporations Code. This request was for things like cash flows, income statements, balance sheets, meeting minutes, a list of shareholders. And that request was withdrawn in July of 2024. Sources report this withdrawal occurred following private discussions. The exact nature of any resolution has not been publicly disclosed, but multiple sources really describe this period as a turning point. Financial scrutiny appeared to increase, confidence among lenders and investors started to change. In September of 2024, a new chief financial officer, CFO, was appointed by the board that had formed during this period. This appointment is reflected in public filings and materials that were described to me by multiple sources familiar with the situation. Those materials indicate a current board structure of about 5 members, Stephen Sharif is not listed as a member of the board in those materials. But really from this point forward, multiple sources describe a noticeable shift in how decisions were made. In August 2024, Intrepid Studios announced the Alpha 2 roadmap, and sources describe internal concerns about whether the announced timelines were realistic. Some developers reported that dates had not been fully discussed with the teams before being announced publicly. The roadmap live stream contained visible errors and inconsistencies that longtime viewers noticed immediately. And Alpha 2 Phase 1, it launched in October 2024. Phase 2 followed in December during the holiday season, which was an unusual choice given the studio's, historical winter shutdown. Developers were, already fatigued, and Phase 2 experienced difficulties through that, though development did, obviously continued. Phase 3 was later delayed from May to August, and by the time it launched, really engagement had already began to decline. By mid 2025, financial pressure seems to have intensified. In August 2025, internal discussions reportedly began around a potential Steam Early Access release targeting November. According to multiple sources, really this was driven by sort of mounting financial pressure and concerns related to debt obligations. Employees were informed shortly before the public announcement. Information from an internal meeting later suggested that many team members really were surprised by that decision. And Steam Early Access launched in December 2025. And based on internal reporting described to me by multiple sources, the release actually exceeded expectations and generated revenue measured in the millions of dollars. However, sources consistently state that this was not enough to resolve the company's underlying financial issues. And then in December 2025 and January 2026, pressure from lenders reportedly intensified. Multiple sources describe a default notice being issued by a lender previously connected to earlier debt discussions. This coincided with internal discussions involving Article 9 foreclosure process and Warren Act considerations. Around the same time, new corporate entities, including TFE Games Holdings, were being formed. Public filings and communications reviewed to date are consistent with preparations for asset control or restructuring. The full ownership structure, has not been publicly confirmed. Sources describe this period as the point at which foreclosure shifted from a theoretical risk to an immediate threat. The sources indicated that foreclosure proceedings had advanced and that assets were expected to possibly be transferred to TFE, though this has, again, not been publicly confirmed. In early January, employees were informed the studio would transition fully to remote work. The physical office was vacated over several weeks. This appears to have been a cost-cutting measure with estimated monthly rent upwards of $100,000 a month, potentially. Despite these measures, employees, they continued working to support live operations and development. And according to sources, payroll strain and internal uncertainty, continued to increase. And then on Friday, January 30th, of course, a video was published by Kira, a creator known for covering issues in the game development industry. In that video, he stated that something serious was occurring behind the scenes at Intrepid Studios, and that he was, working to verify details before releasing more information. While that video received pushback, the concerns raised align with information later shared independently by multiple sources connected to the studio. Around the same time, I began receiving messages from individuals with direct ties to Intrepid Studios as well. As Friday progressed, a public signal appeared, numerous employees began updating their LinkedIn profiles to indicate they were open to work. By Friday evening, roughly a dozen profiles reflected this change. By Saturday, that number had grown significantly. And as reported by Kira, this all sort of was the product of employees being notified of some of the layoffs or changes that were coming. Internally, employees noted calendar meetings. They started seeing labeled things like AOC leadership and board of directors session appearing toward the end of January. And despite this lack of formal communication, it was pretty clear that something seemed off or wrong. And then, of course, late Saturday, January 31st, the situation escalated. Multiple individuals independently reported receiving what they described as a WARN Act notice. According to these reports, the notice stated that all employees were expected to be terminated, with operations expected to end by close of business on Monday, February 2nd, 2026. As of February 3rd, 2026, multiple employees reported that they had received individual termination notifications. Also, the WARN Act website has since listed Intrepid Studios as a permanent closure, reflecting a reported impact of 123 employees. Employees also described receiving an accompanying email that stated, no final decisions had been made regarding which positions would be affected, and that some employees might be asked to continue working temporarily. This clearly introduced some confusion to this process, as you can imagine. And that same communication reportedly stated that payroll obligations would not be met and that scheduled paychecks would not be issued due to the company's financial condition. Employees were also informed that health benefits were ending and that COBRA coverage would be required at employee cost. These notices have not been released publicly by the company. Shortly after these reports started emerging, Stephen Sharif informed staff internally that he had resigned. According to the accounts shared with me, he explained that extended development timelines required reliance on private lenders and investors, which altered ownership structure and decision-making authority. He stated that decisions made over the past year were ones he could no longer support. And sources have told me that his resignation actually took effect internally on January 26th. Shortly afterward, Stephen Sharif publicly confirmed his resignation in the Ashes of Creation Discord. In that message, he stated that control of the company had shifted away from him and he resigned in protest. Following this, other senior leaders had also stepped away. Margaret Crone publicly announced that she was no longer with the company and was seeking new work. Employees subsequently confirmed missed paychecks, terminated benefits, and unpaid bonuses. Some expected as early as October of 2025. Following these events, Margaret publicly shared her perspective in a personal Reddit post. In that statement, she described a period of prolonged uncertainty, emotional strain, and obviously difficult internal dynamics leading up to her departure. She emphasized the personal toll the situation took, expressed care for the development team and community, and stated that, while she could not speak for every decision made, she no longer felt able to continue under the current circumstances. She clearly is loved by the employees that worked with her, and they all have had nothing but extremely positive things to say about her. And through talking to my sources, it seems pretty clear she really did not know what was going on behind the scenes. as this started to play out in front of us. So, sources distinguish between the internal decision to close the studio, which appears to have been made on January 31st, and the formal employee notifications that followed. Multiple sources described attempts to explore alternatives, including workforce reductions, overseas development, restructuring. I've reviewed references to proposals that would have reduced staff from approximately 210 employees to 100 by the middle of February, an attempt to reduce payroll by 50%. No agreement was reached, and following the leadership resignations, the decision was reportedly made to terminate all remaining employees and shut down Intrepid Studios entirely. What this all means, employees report missed pay, terminated benefits, unpaid bonuses. Families have been extremely affected by all of this, careers disrupted, important healthcare disrupted. This does not appear to be at all a failure of effort by developers. Based off the available information, it reflects a breakdown driven by financial pressure and control disputes. From mid-2024 through January 2026, you have a pretty consistent pattern that emerges, one of financial scrutiny, investor pressure, accelerated milestones, emergency monetization, layoffs, leadership resignations, and ultimately a company-wide termination. Based on currently available information, Intrepid Studios appears to be shutting down, and Ashes of Creation in its current form appears to be ending. The servers will likely close really soon, as soon as AWS shuts them down. This has been a very, very difficult period for those involved. I really want anyone that watches this to understand just how hard this has been on the team, and on all of the employees at Intrepid. They loved this game, and they could not wait to show you what they were making. They were so close on so many goals and milestones. Ask anyone that was in the content creator program. We were close to some really, really cool things. For them, Intrepid has been a family. And, they're hurting. They're really hurting. So, remember when you're talking to them or about them, kind of what they're going through. They did not know what was going on. They just wanted to make you a kick-ass game. And now many of them are actually saying they're sorry that they didn't. Despite the fact that they're going through this, they're still apologetic for not giving us the game that they wanted to give us. And I think that just speaks a lot to the people that were behind this project. So when you talk to him, when you think about him, you might just give him a thank you, actually, as we sort of work through all of this. This report is intended to really document events as accurately and responsibly as possible on the information available at this time. Some details described here are contested and complete or subject to ongoing legal processes. So if new information emerges, or if any details presented here are shown to be inaccurate, I will correct the record publicly. And I've reached out to Intrepid Studios for comment and associated parties. Obviously, if I get responses, I will include those as well in future coverage. Further reporting, what we're going to look at maybe examine some of the legal actions, some of the studio changes, and then also hopefully some content planning, and sort of what is the future of Ashes of Creation as far as an IP. Might not be much. I would urge you to go back and look at some of my old videos. Yes, self-promoting, but from things I've been gathering and learning, a lot of my thoughts and opinions were really not that far off. So, a little bit here, we'll continue with this, in a follow-up video. going forward. So, guys, this has been a really hard time, and we just want to support everyone that's going through a really, really difficult time. And, so I just ask that you hopefully help the team out in any way you can. So thank you.